In our busy, everyday world, we sometimes find ourselves faced with questions about life, family, work, and even God. For Christians, answers can be found in a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's a relationship that reveals new avenues towards finding answers, a relationship that helps make sense of the mysteries we sometimes face. St. Jerome said that ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Jesus Christ. So, if for some of us this relationship is non-existent or needs to be rekindled, then we should begin it again. And just like any relationship, it begins with an introduction.
Welcome back. In this section, we're going to talk about Exodus and 1st and 2nd Samuel. Primarily because, again, we're trying to get a background to understand the characters that are used in the New Testament. In Exodus, we pick up where Genesis leaves off. They're in Egypt. But the opening line of Exodus tells us that a new Pharaoh came along that did not know Joseph. And so, having read that story, we know all that Joseph did for Egypt. But apparently, this particular Pharaoh doesn't recognize that. And he gets jealous, and they begin to enslave the people. It's this enslavement that God is calling them out of. He hears the cry of his people. And we now have the story of Moses, how he came about, how out of Egypt Moses takes his people. We see the 10 plagues that God has had to use to convince Pharaoh to let his people go. And then we also see the travels of the people throughout the desert. Was it a situation that they just didn't know where they were going, and so it took them 40 years to get to the Promised Land? Or was there a grander purpose for that? We'll see that questions this grander purpose. Once they get established in this land, we then find a need for a king. God doesn't want them to have a king, but they want a king. So we'll begin to see the developments that bring about the quintessential king. Not Saul, but his successor, David. And we'll also see the call of the prophets. So we'll begin to get some of these elements in the Old Testament that are important to understanding the characters in the New Testament. And when we can do this, we can begin to understand what it means when someone says Jesus is another David, or he's another Moses. So we begin to understand why those names are so important. We'll also look at a few Psalms, the songbook of Judaism, and for Christianity for thousands of years. This idea that there is a poem or a song that is appropriate for every situation. The Psalter has been under development since the beginning of Judaism, well into the time of Christianity. And Jesus and all the disciples knew the Psalms back and forth. They knew them because they were raised with them. They grew up with them. It is the soundtrack of their life. And so Jesus will use Psalms quite often to convey the ideas that he's trying to get at. So as we look at those, again, try to see how all of this relates or will relate to the New Testament. Okay, welcome back. We're going to talk about Exodus and Samuel and the Psalms. As again, we're hitting the highlights of the Old Testament that are going to be very important for the New Testament. So, as we look at Exodus, we've picked up the story where Genesis leaves off. So Exodus has the family, the 12 tribes of Israel, in Egypt now. And we have this horrible situation where the Pharaoh, a new Pharaoh comes in that does not know Joseph, which means someone that does not recognize all that Joseph has done for the kingdom. And so he's a little curious as to why there are all these Hebrews around. And they do look distinct. They look different. They look like foreigners in Egypt. So it's easy to tell. And they start to recognize, there's a lot of them here, man. If they decided to get together, they're going to destroy us. They could actually take us out. So the Pharaoh gets very paranoid and begins to enslave them. And so now we have several hundred years of enslavement, and we find them now at a point where they're crying out to God for a Savior. And then there is a prediction by one of the Pharaoh's soothsayers that there will be a deliverer. So a deliverer needs to be killed, the Pharaoh says. So I don't know who he is, so let's just take care of them all. And the problem with this is they're trying to take care of a situation by just mass genocide. And this doesn't work. Now notice there's a parallel here. When Jesus was born, other soothsayers said that there is a Messiah, a king that's been born. The wise men come in, the Magi come in, and they talk to Herod. And Herod says, "Oh, really? Tell me about this." For the sole purpose of getting rid of him. So he also kills. We have the slaughter of the innocents. But the first slaughter of the innocents is in Exodus. But Moses is saved from this. Moses, the typical story you hear, he's put in a basket and then floated down the river and is picked up by the Pharaoh's daughter. Now, if you've seen the Ten Commandments, the old movie with Charlton Heston, you recognize that it's not exactly, oh, look, the sea gods have given me a baby. This is great. One of the big glaring problem with the movie, it's a great movie, but is that they don't seem to recognize that he's a Hebrew child. If you look through the scriptures, everybody knows it's a Hebrew child. Interesting enough, the Disney story, Prince of Egypt, I think it's called, is, we recognize he looks different. He's different. There's something different about him. He is a Hebrew. So it's more that she would like to keep him as a pet. This is my pet project. Can I keep him? It's like, oh, okay, whatever makes my daughter happy, she can have him. So this is more the situation. He grows up. But then he ends up seeing an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And there's a tussle, and he kills a man. It says in Exodus 2, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian. It's against the law to kill Egyptians, and I don't care if you're the Pharaoh's daughter's pet, you will still get executed for that. So he fled. He left. He went to Midian and started a new life as a shepherd. Got married. Then you have the burning bush issue. All of a sudden, God wants to contact Moses. And so he puts up a little flare. It's a burning bush. It's a little bit like the notification light. You've got a message. So after a few days, he goes up and he checks this out. It's like, this bush has been burning, but it's not been burned up or hasn't started a massive forest fire. So what's going on? So he went up there and he gets the mission. Moses, take off your shoes. This is hallowed ground. I'm sending you to my people. And of course, Moses argues. I'm not really good at this. I'm not your guy. But God gives him help eventually. He gives him his brother Aaron. One of the tradition is that Moses has a stuttering problem. And so he doesn't want to speak in public because people will make fun of him and they won't believe him. And it's considered an affliction. And so if you're afflicted by some disease, you are accursed by God. And so how can he be the one that's going to deliver them if he's accursed by God? So God gives him Aaron. He says, go and seek out Aaron. And then Moses says, but behold, they will not believe me nor listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. And then he tells him that he's going to give him Aaron as a mouthpiece, as a way of speaking. So he returns to Egypt, and he makes some requests, which actually makes it worse for the Hebrew slaves at the time. And then we get the plagues. God says to the Pharaoh, I will send you, through Moses, I'm going to send you plagues. So we have the Nile turning to blood, frogs, gnats, swarms of flies, the death of Egyptians' livestock. None of these plagues, up until the ninth one, actually impacts the land of Goshen, which is where the Hebrews are. Boils, thunder and hail, locusts, and darkness. It's that kind of darkness where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. The final plague is, in a sense, one that the Pharaoh will bring upon himself. He calls for the death of the firstborn Hebrew children. And God says, that is there you go. Now, interestingly enough, this is where the plagues now affect everybody. All of Egypt, including Goshen, will get this plague. So what we have is this idea that you are now to offer a sacrifice to God. And how's a sacrifice? What's a sacrifice going to look like? Well, on your doorway, if you have this door here, what I want you to do is take a lamb, kill the lamb, and sprinkle the blood on the doorposts and the lintel. What we're getting here is the institution of the Passover. Passover is where if you live in this house, then the angel of death will, and you've done this with the blood, pass over your house, but kill all the firstborn of others. So the Hebrews were told to do this. And then you have a lamb and unleavened bread, some wine, bitter herbs, things like this. The idea is, with the lamb especially, it is the sacrifice. You have to kill the lamb and then roast it, which is like the fire of a sacrifice. And then you have to eat the lamb. This is the way in which, through a offering sacrifice, you are you're having communion with God. You're having a meal with God. So you have to eat the lamb. There are no vegetarians getting out of Egypt. So you have to eat the lamb. Unleavened bread, because it's traveler's bread. With leavening, you have to let it rise. You have to prepare it. Unleavened bread is just flour, water, salt. Mix, put on, and you eat it. So it's traveler's bread. All these things are for people that are going to escape the next day. So you eat it as if you're about to leave. And this Passover is still celebrated to this day by Jews. But this becomes the high holy day, because this is the day that you will be delivered from Egypt. And so the next day comes, and the Egyptians are beaten. They send them out, go, just go, just go, just go, just go. And they give them their money. Here, I'll take jewels, take everything. Just take it. Just go away. Get out of here. Your God has beaten us. Now, as they did this, they left, and they were excited until they recognized we're heading out to the desert. And it began to get tough. So the idea was Moses to lead them to the promised land, back to where they originally were, where Abraham came from. And so they were going out, and they found themselves, it's a bit hard. And so they're complaining and complaining and complaining. Why did we leave with you? Did you bring us out here just to let us die in the desert? God was constantly with them. He was there in a cloud or a pillar of fire at night. So there would be, some way of looking out the tent. Is God still with us? Yes, there he is. But that wasn't enough. We're hungry. We're thirsty. So this is where the idea of manna from heaven. He gives them a way to eat, and pheasant, another way to eat some meat. And then Moses strikes a rock, and from the rock flows water. From the rock flows living water. See how that's going to get used in the New Testament? So, again, we're getting all these allusions. Moses led them out of slavery. Jesus leads people out, leads you out of slavery to sin. So we're making these connections. As we see these Old Testament characters, we're now beginning to see how they relate to the New Testament. So we have the Passover institutionalized, if you will, and then the people make their way to Mount Sinai. And this is where Moses says, okay, wait here. I'm going to go up Mount Sinai. I'm going to commune with God. I don't know what I'm going to get. And so he goes up there, and it takes some 40 days or so. He's up there quite a long time, to the point that people think he's dead. He's not up there. He died. He's dead. He was an old guy to start with. He's dead now. That's problematic. So they begin to get worried, and they think, well, the guy that's leading us out, he's dead, so what do? We make our own God. They've fallen back in their old Egyptian ways. You know, when you live in a land for 400 years, you pick up their ways. And so they fashioned a golden calf. Aaron actually does the work. Fashion a golden calf. And they begin to worship it by using the old fertility worship services, which essentially was some kind of sexual orgy and libation offerings of wine and things like this. So now we get all kinds of chaos. When finally Moses comes down, and he has these 2 tablets that have commandments. This is where the 10 commandments come from. And he sees them doing all this, and then he just screams a warning, and he ends up smashing the tablets, showing them that they're in trouble. And this is where the house of Levi becomes a house that will enforce the rules. And so the house of Levi goes out and wipes out 1/3 of the people because of their debauchery. So Levi has now become a house that will enforce the laws. This is why we have Levitical laws, the house of Levi. They're in charge now. They're going to be the priests. And so, again, he goes back up, gets another copy, and begins to lead them out. As they go, they decide to fashion an ark, a way of carrying. They picked up the stones, the tablets of the 10 Commandments, some of the manna they had in there, and Aaron's staff that you read about. And they carry it. So now this is the Ark. This is Raiders of the Lost Ark, Ark of the Covenant. And they carry that before them. That becomes something now, a focal point for worship, is this Ark of the Covenant. And it's very detailed. It's very much something that is beautiful and at the same time terrifying, because no one can touch it except those that are the proper priests. And unfortunately for them, there's a scene in there where you find that one of them has been touched by someone, because the ark was about to fall, and someone grabs it. He is struck dead immediately by God. So he's serious. God is serious about this. This is a sacred time. So they begin to go in, and they end up marching into the Promised Land. It's not a barren land. There's people there, so they have to fight it. They have to fight for it. It's part of God's justice, because it's the people that are descendants of the one who sinned against God. So God says, now it's time for them to be punished for their sins. So as they go in and they take the land, they partition it off into various sections. As you can see, there's different sections for the different tribes, all the way from Dan all the way down to Benjamin and Judah. As they do this, they recognize that they're being attacked from all sides as well. And nobody wants them there, so they're constantly being attacked, and they need protection. So God allows them to have judges, regional governors, and then that's still not enough. They clamor for a king. So what we have is Saul chosen by the people to be a king. And he's not exactly the greatest person. He ends up failing as a king and ends up blaspheming, putting in various and disobeying God. So now it's God's turn to pick the successor. And this is David. So as you look through 1 Samuel 16 through 18, you get this way of picking David. He's the youngest, sort of the runt of the family. He's a ruddy-looking kid. He's a shepherd. He smells like sheep. And people don't really look at shepherds very fondly because they smell. And they're usually ill-mannered because they're just around sheep all day. Now, as he's picked and anointed by Samuel, it's a quiet thing. Don't tell anybody that God has picked you just yet. The time is not right. And this is where we have, David, the son of Jesse, sends his youngest son to the court of the king. And we have this interaction. David is playing the stringed lyre and composing songs, because that's what he does when he's with the sheep. And so he's accredited with writing the various psalms that we have. A psalm of David, a psalm attributed to David. And these are the songs that he sings to God. And God removes his favor from Saul, so Saul has these massive headaches. And the only thing that eases up his headache is David singing psalms. So he has him around quite often. Now, we also have the David and Goliath episode. David is the one that conquers Goliath, the giant. And because of this, he begins to get a reputation of, being a great warrior, which makes Saul a bit jealous. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. It's a bad thing for your king to get jealous of you. So he starts chasing after David, thinking David is going to take over the kingdom. David proves that he's not, by not killing Saul, even though he has several opportunities. Saul recognizes this, and they reconcile, and makes David one of his great generals. And so as David's going out conquering certain sections, Saul goes out fighting another battle, and he dies. He ends up killing himself. If you look at 1 Samuel 31, we find that he ends up thrusting himself on the sword because he recognizes the enemy is coming, and if they capture a king alive, that's a great bargaining chip. He doesn't want that to happen, so he kills himself. So in 2 Samuel, we pick up where David gets the message and unfortunately kills the messenger. But you now have David's kingdom beginning. He reigned 3 years out of Hebron, and he realizes he needs a place to call his own, and this is where he takes Jerusalem. And he builds that city up as the city of David, the city where the ark will stand. So the ark of the covenant now has a permanent place. It doesn't just travel around. It has a place, and he's planning on building a temple, but God says, no, not you. Your son will do that. So as David continues, we also have the unfortunate situation with him and Bathsheba, where he is not doing what kings should be doing. In the time where kings went out to battle, David was sitting in the sunroof, just casually not going out to war. So unfortunately, David is not doing his job. He sees Bathsheba, and he wants her. So unfortunately, she's already married, but that doesn't matter. He's the king, so he impregnates her, and then he tries to hide his adultery. He calls in the troops. Now, the husband of Bathsheba is Uriah, who is one of David's generals. So he comes back from the battle and says, I tell you what, why don't you go home, say hi to your wife. It's been a while since you've seen her, so, trying to make sure that when he goes home, he's obviously going to have relations with his wife so they can attribute the baby to that. Uriah says, no, my king is here, so I will stand guard. He doesn't leave. So it turns out that David gets impatient and says, all right, go, I'll send you out to this battle. And what I want you to do is take him, and he tells the other generals, when I give the signal, draw back. And so they all go out, and they draw back, leaving Uriah in the middle of the enemy, and he gets killed. So now he's dead, so he can take Bathsheba as his wife. Nathan, his prophet, doesn't let him get away with it. So we see Nathan coming back and saying, you have done wrong. And at this point, David becomes repentant. And we also see various implications of this. Because of David's breaking the commandments, we find that there is trouble in Israel. Earlier, before he did this, God had promised that no trouble would befall Israel. It will have solid, secure boundaries, and no one will bother it anymore until this happened. Because of corporate identity, now Israel, the sword will never leave Israel. And so you can bet that from this point, even to today, Israel is fighting. So we see the consequences of one act, one sin, adultery.
Bye.